In this presentation, I'd like to look at language issues in Hong Kong. I want to pay particular attention to schooling and tertiary education. But first, let me just talk a little bit about Hong Kong, some background information. Hong Kong prides itself on being an international city, but in my view, it's actually a very strong Chinese city with a veneer of internationalization at the top. The population is growing quite rapidly. It's now over 7 million. It's risen by approximately 1.5 million in the last 20 years. So there's quite a lot of population pressure, it's population density. There's a lot of immigration from mainland China, which is affecting the demographics of Hong Kong at the moment. It's a special administrative region since the handover of 1997 at the end of the British colonial era. Hong Kong has been awarded the status of special administrative region. For the next 50 years, it is said that there'll be no change to the political orientation and the economic orientation of Hong Kong. Education is seen as the ladder that people can use to climb up and to achieve a better life. Asian values, Confucian values are espoused. Family orientation, loyalty to one's parents and one's ancestors, strong bonds of friendship, and also, I would say, a commitment to learning, to betterment of oneself. For example, a Confucian teacher is not somebody who just knows their subject well, but who also embodies the virtues of a good person. Turning to languages in Hong Kong, Cantonese is the major language, although some people dispute whether or not it's a language. Some people say it's just a dialect, an argot even, mainly because the spoken form has become divorced from the written form of Chinese. But it is a major southern Chinese language. It's got a very strong literary tradition. Many of the ancient poems in Chinese rhyme in Cantonese, but they don't rhyme in Mandarin, which indicates the history of Cantonese.
I love Cantonese much more than Putonghua.
It's not indigenous to Hong Kong. It was transplanted to Hong Kong with the migration over the last 200 years. But it's become adopted by the people of Hong Kong, and it's actually become strongly part of the Hong Kong identity as expressed through Canto Pop, for example, and some of the Cantonese film industry, the media, the mass media in Hong Kong, all of these using Cantonese as a way of expressing the Hong Kong identity. It's the first language of well over 90% of the population. But it does suffer from social stigma because it uses a lot of slang. It's a street language in the form that's been adopted in Hong Kong. People don't ascribe very high social status to it. You're considered more educated if you use English, for example. And this has had an effect on the role and status of Cantonese after 1997. The other major player in terms of Chinese languages is Mandarin, or Putonghua as it's called in the mainland. Putonghua just means the standard national language. It was established after 1949 in the People's Republic, and its main purpose is to unify the country, to give a single language that people can speak. It's based on the grammar and the literature of northern China, and so there's considerable bias towards Beijing, a lot of rivalry between Beijing and the southern city Guangzhou, and so there are benefits that the northerners get when it comes to the national language. It's been simplified, the written form's been simplified as part of the mass literacy campaigns that followed the communist takeover, so that the peasants who had largely supported the Communist Party could have greater access to literacy. In Hong Kong, Putonghua is increasingly in demand from employers because of trade with the mainland. It's actively promoted for political reasons, for national unity. We talk about one country, two systems, but we tend to say now one country much more strongly than two systems. In the past, Putonghua was not taught much in schools. It didn't have high social status. If you spoke Putonghua, it implied that you were from the mainland and from the countryside and you were poor. So 20 years ago, you wouldn't hear much Putonghua. However, it's increasingly used in Hong Kong. There's been a lot more settlement of more affluent mainlanders in Hong Kong, much more shopping tourism, and so the prestige of Putonghua has risen. English is the former language of colonialism, but it was kept on, and if anything, it's grown in strength because of its value for trade, communications. Tourism is a big facet of Hong Kong economy. International relations, the media, we have TV stations in English, we have radio stations, and we have newspapers such as South China Morning Post. But the linguistic distance between English and Chinese is quite large. It's socially very prestigious. It's in great demand from employers and therefore parents who see it as the language for success at university and employment. But it doesn't have a very strong ethno-linguistic base in Hong Kong. It's not spoken outside of academic institutions and the odd lesson in schools. And it's a very difficult medium of instruction because the language is alien and the concepts which are being described are often unfamiliar to the students. So although English is used as a medium of instruction in 100 schools, at least 100 schools in Hong Kong, students often struggle with their learning and they would tend to resort to rote learning, memorization at times. Now, Hong Kong's got over 1,000 schools, 700 primary schools, over 450 secondary schools. They're divided into government schools. Government schools are directly funded by the government and they make up about 10%. The rest are subsidized schools. They are subsidized by religious groups such as the Buddhists, Lutherans, the Catholics and the Anglican diocese, by community groups, by the Jockey Club, which is a community charity based on the gambling industry, by people who want to honour relatives who've passed away, and these schools, as I say, make up about 90% of the number of schools, and they receive a subsidy from the government as well, but their management is carried out by the organisations that back them. The schools tend to mix British and Chinese traditions. School uniforms, for example, in the winter are school blazers in the British tradition. In the summertime, it's more traditionally Chinese in orientation. Some of the girls wear the traditional Chinese dresses as their uniform. There's a big respect for teachers. You stand up when the teacher comes into the classroom. You bow to a teacher. We have 3 different mediums of instruction. We have English. Most schools are Cantonese medium of instruction, but they would like to be English medium for marketing reasons. And a growing number of schools, although quite small at the moment, a growing number of schools are using Putonghua as the medium of instruction. At the tertiary level, there are 8 UGC funded universities, the most famous being the University of Hong Kong, We also have the Chinese University of Hong Kong, which was set up in the early 1960s in order to focus on Chinese language and Chinese culture. The actual name Chinese University refers to language rather than geographical location. Hong Kong University of Science and Technology is a relatively new university, but very prestigious. Then we have two former polytechnics which have become universities, City U and Hong Kong Poly U. We have the Baptist University, Lingnan University, which is a very old university that used to be based in southern China. And we have the Hong Kong Institute of Education, where I work, which was formed 20 years ago by amalgamating various colleges of education in a move to upgrade the quality of teacher education. There are also some self-funded universities. We have the Open University of Hong Kong, which was based on the UK model, and a couple of universities that are sponsored either by wealthy individuals or by business organisations. If we look back at policy history, and I'll cover this fairly briefly, in terms of language in education, in the early part of the colonial period, education was designed mainly for the elite of the Chinese population. The idea of British colonialism was to create a sandwich where the colonial British were at the top of the sandwich and the ordinary populace at the bottom, but the meat of the sandwich formed a buffer zone, if I can mix metaphors, of educated Chinese who understood Western ways and understood local Chinese ways, and they would be the go-betweens between the two, and reduce friction between the colonial classes and the ordinary population. In those days, the economy of Hong Kong was really based around the fact it was a port on the way to Australia, on the way to Southeast Asia, and so on. It didn't have a very strong economic base of its own. After the Second World War, the British came back to Hong Kong. The Civil War was still going on in China, and there were lots of refugees coming down to Hong Kong. In those days, there was a touch base policy, which meant anybody who was able to reach Hong Kong was allowed to stay there. The fall of the British Empire, the loss of India in particular, meant that Hong Kong had to establish its own industrial base, which it did through light industry, mainly the plastics industry, textiles. The Made in Hong Kong era was around this time, using the refugees mainly to work in the factories. The education system moved more towards vocational training. There was a move to use Cantonese as the medium of instruction because of mass education. In 1984, the agreement to hand Hong Kong back to China was agreed. There was a signing ceremony between Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping. At the same time, though, Hong Kong's identity was growing. There was a greater sense of self-identity, and this has created tensions since the handover. Economically, China embarked upon the four modernizations. Its economy took off, and also a lot of Hong Kong's factories moved across the border to Shenzhen and Guangdong, and Hong Kong had to reinvent itself as a services industry sector, banking, and tourism. And this has had a knock-on effect in education. The nature of citizenship was contested. Are we Chinese? Are we Hong Kongers? Are we Hong Kong Chinese? Are we Chinese Hong Kong? All these kind of issues began to be debated among local citizenship.
I think I'm a Hong Kong Chinese.
Usually I will say I am Hong Kong. I'm Hong Konger. I'm proud of being a Hong Kong person.
Generic skills were deemed important. The emergence of 21st century skills, soft skills, they become emphasized in the curriculum, and communication skills was one of the major ones. Post handover, China has been stressing patriotism. We've had the big argument over national education, which Hong Kong people rejected as fearing it to be too much like Chinese propaganda. The Hong Kong identity has been officially downplayed, even though it's still quite strong among the local people. China's economic boom has opened up trading possibilities for Hong Kong and has also enhanced the prestige of Putonghua. The official language policy since 1997 has been biliteracy and trilingualism, which means biliteracy in written Chinese and in English, and trilingualism in Cantonese, Putonghua or Mandarin, and English. The pedagogy changed. There's been more emphasis on learner-centeredness, information technology. But given the generally conservative nature of schools, the changes have been rather slow. Recent major reforms, there was an attempt immediately after the handover to force schools to use Cantonese as the medium of instruction so that mother tongue learning could enhance the quality of learning. But this provoked a major reaction among schools and particularly parents, and that eventually got played down. The major reforms of the early 2000s, Learning for Life and Learning to Learn, were promoting the 21st century skills. More recently, we've had the fine-tuning, so-called, of the language policy, which has really opened it up to market forces, which means that English has become very important again as the medium of instruction, and more schools are looking to open up classes using English as the medium of instruction. We've also had the new secondary school curriculum in 2009, which is to replace the old British 5+2 secondary structure with the 3 years junior secondary and 3 years senior secondary, which is similar to the structure on the mainland. So that again is greater alignment with mainland China. So Putonghua has emerged as the language of national identity. English as the international language, much demanded by employers, and also the earmark of the elite educated members of society. Cantonese has tended to be downplayed because Hong Kong identity is seen as almost a threat to national identity. There's certainly a good deal of tension around that. At the university level, most universities would claim to be EMI because this is the language of academia. However, in practice, what goes on behind the closed door is more questionable. There are stories that Cantonese is very often used, or even Putonghua is used, even though it's against the official university policy. One measure that's being used to reinforce English as the medium is annually the IELTS scores of university graduates are produced in the local newspaper. There's a lot of interest paid to the language standards, a lot of discussion as to whether English language standards are deteriorating. But these help to reinforce the role and status of English in universities. In fact, in Chinese university, there was a major controversy in the last couple of years when the university authorities decided to make English the official medium of instruction. But it produced a major outcry that this was going against the whole raison d'etre of the university, that Chinese university was set up to preserve the Chinese language and Chinese culture. And so the authorities were forced to row back and allow Chinese to remain as the official language. Here in Hong Kong IED we have something which we call functional trilingualism, which means we're aiming to make sure our students have the Cantonese ability in their social life, in their professional life, and in academia, that they're developing Putonghua in those three areas, and also they are having at least intermediate standard of English, that they're able to cope with the academic demands of English, if not excel in English, that they have some ability socially and professionally in English, but we at the moment are emphasizing Cantonese as the first language that we feel that they need to become completely fluent in. This might well change over time. Obviously, functional trilingualism would transit towards English the higher up you go, so that nearly all of our postgraduate work, for example, would be English medium. There's also, with globalization, there's a strong push towards internationalization. But in Hong Kong, internationalization really has been mainlandization. Most of our international students are actually from the mainland. In fact, over 90% according to a recent survey.
I'm from Shanghai.
I'm from Liaoning, Dalian.
In mainland China?
Yeah, in mainland China.
I'm from Zhejiang province, Ningbo.
So this has got language effects in raising the profile of Putonghua in universities. But actually many of the mainlanders actually want to come to Hong Kong in order to improve their English.
And actually I like English a lot, so I major in English.
I'm also major in English. I come Hong Kong to study English. The atmosphere of English is better than mainland China.
So it reinforces English, and Cantonese once again is the loser. So there are a number of language challenges facing Hong Kong at the moment. The first is the fluctuation in role and status of the different languages. English has managed to stay on, despite being the ex-colonial language. Putonghua is rising rapidly. Meanwhile, Cantonese, I think, is under threat from the two languages, Putonghua and English, but also from the fact that Cantonese is associated with Hong Kong identity, which is in strong tension with national identity. So I think that Cantonese is becoming increasingly endangered, and it's a challenge to maintain the language. And this threat to Cantonese is also reflected over the border. Recently there was a furore when the Beijing government announced that Guangdong would have to change its TV presentation of all news programs. Most of the primetime TV programs would have to be broadcast in Putonghua, not in Cantonese. And there's a feeling in Guangdong province that Cantonese is under threat there as well. There are many challenges within schools. Over 50% of the school curriculum is dedicated to languages, but we have a shortage of trained language teachers. Many of the teachers of English in schools were not trained as English language teachers. They were geography teachers or history teachers. And this also has an effect in primary schools where teachers are subject trained. It's not an integrated approach, it's a subject specialist approach. And many of the teachers of English there are simply not trained to teach English. Students don't have a high motivation to learn English in particular. It's seen as an alien language, not particularly useful to them in their daily life.
When I was very young, I didn't enjoy learning English very much because there's no English learning environment. Everyone, including my family, my relatives and friends, are all Chinese, and it's very difficult if you don't have the environment. You just learn it by yourself or the limited lessons.
And I think generally Hong Kong society has unrealistic expectations as to the level of English that can be learnt in the current context. The native speakers are often used as the target. The way that exercise books are marked, perfect English is used as the model. Schools also are suffering from too many reforms. They're not able to adjust to 21st century skills, to exam reform, which is emphasizing spoken skills, and so they're having difficulty in accommodating all these changes. And another big issue that's raised recently is ethnic minorities. We have quite a few resident ethnic minority groups, plus the transitional minority groups. And the education reforms recently have made Chinese, particularly Cantonese, a core subject. And it's native speaker level of Chinese. There's no provision for Chinese as a second language. And so ethnic minorities are saying that they are disadvantaged by the education system. And now that's receiving attention from the education authorities. So I think working in education, we need to find a balance between the three languages. And some of the principles, the political, economic and pedagogical principles. Political principles, I think every student has the right to access first language literacy. I think politically national unity is important and the propagation of Chinese cultural values. And every student should have the right to access any high status language. Economically, we need to have three languages to prepare the workforce for local, regional and international trade. And we do need to develop these soft skills, even though the schools currently are not well set up and the assessment system in particular is not designed to enhance generic skills. We have to bear in mind the capacity of students to learn three languages, and also the capacity of teachers to teach the three languages, and also the capacity of the school system to deliver three languages. The solution might lie in multilingual language learning. Instead of differentiating schools according to English as a medium instruction, Cantonese as a medium instruction, Putonghua as a medium instruction, maybe look at multilingual schools where all three languages could be used as the medium instruction and all three languages learnt as individual subjects. So if we were to develop a scheme with the goal of enhancing biliteracy and trilingualism, we could look at first language oracy and fluency and developing competence in the second and third language. Again, this idea of functional trilingualism, which I mentioned earlier. If we look at how that might be mapped into a primary and secondary school curriculum, the main focus would be on Cantonese. Putonghua and English would be introduced for oracy, Putonghua for cultural literacy, English more for academic and vocational literacy. And we could use the different media of instruction accordingly and appropriately across and within different subjects. At the tertiary level, again, the emphasis on the first language and the development of Putonghua as the second language, and then English would be the third language up to an appropriate and achievable level, which I would see as intermediate English. So overall, I think there are many challenges facing Hong Kong. We have this challenge of trilingualism, but it's a very complex form of trilingualism. We have Chinese, which involves Putonghua, involves Cantonese, it involves simplified characters, it involves traditional full-form characters, and the gap between the Cantonese language and the written form of the language. All these make the language policy at secondary school, primary school and tertiary level extremely complicated. Thank you.